The mistress slapped me, 8 months pregnant, in open court, but it was the judge's next 2 words that made my husband's face turn white. 8 months pregnant. I sat alone at the defense table when my husband's mistress slapped me across the face in open court. Her palm cracked against my cheek, and the sound bounced off the marble walls like a gunshot. My lips split against my teeth. I tasted copper before I felt the sting. My hand moved on instinct, covering my stomach before it covered my face. 8 months pregnant, struck in a courtroom, in front of a bailiff, a stenographer, and Judge Marcus Halloran himself. My husband, Grant Whitmore, looked at Brooke Sinclair's hand, the one that had just hit me, and he laughed, quiet, private. The kind of laugh 2 people share when they think no one else understands the joke. I had heard that laugh before, across dinner tables and hospital waiting rooms, and once, memorably, at my mother's funeral when he thought I wasn't looking. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't aimed past me. It was aimed at me, in front of witnesses, and something in my chest went very still and very cold. That laugh was the moment I stopped being afraid of him. Weston Hale, my attorney, wasn't in the room yet. His chair sat empty beside me, and I had never in my life felt so exposed. Grant's 3 attorneys flanked him like a wall of gray suits. Brooke stood just behind his shoulder, her hand still raised slightly, like she was deciding whether to do it again. The bailiff had already started moving toward us. I sat there with blood on my lip and my daughter kicking against my ribs, and I thought very clearly, this is the day everything changes. I didn't know yet how right I was. I need to back up. 6 years, to be exact, to a spring night in Wilmington, North Carolina, when I was 26 years old, and I believed, with the total, unshakable confidence of the young, that I understood the man I was about to marry. My name is Eleanor Hastings. Everyone called me Nora. I grew up in a house my grandfather built with his own hands, and then, decades later, with the profits of Sterling Manor Group, the real estate and investment firm he founded in 1978. By the time I was born, Sterling Manor managed commercial properties across 3 states and had a reputation in Wilmington for being run with an old-fashioned kind of integrity that made banks trust it and competitors resent it. My mother, Margaret Hastings, took over as CEO when I was 19. She was sharp, exacting, and the only person who ever made me feel like being a Hastings was a job I had to earn, rather than a birthright I could coast on. I met Grant at a charity gala for the Cape Fear Children's Hospital in the spring I turned 25. He was 40, already a name in Wilmington business circles, the CEO of a logistics company called Meridian Freight Partners that his father had built and he had expanded. He was polished in a way that felt, at the time, like confidence rather than performance. He asked me about the seating chart before he asked me my name. He remembered 3 weeks later that I'd mentioned my grandmother's pearl earrings, and he had a matching bracelet made for my birthday. I thought that was romance. I understand now it was reconnaissance. We married the following spring when I was 26 and he was 41. My mother liked him well enough at first, though she once told me, over coffee, that she couldn't get a straight answer out of him about anything that mattered. I told her she was being paranoid. I want to be honest about that because it matters later. I dismissed her instincts. I was in love, and love made me stupid in a very specific, very common way. About 4 months into the marriage, Grant suggested gently over dinner that I step back from my role at Sterling Manor. Not forever, he said. Just while we settled into married life. He had a friend, a financial manager named Walter Greer, who could help simplify my finances so I wouldn't have to think about spreadsheets while I figured out what my new life looked like. I didn't know then that Walter Greer had been on Grant's payroll for 11 months before I ever heard his name. I found that out much later, in a discovery document with a highlighted line that made my hand shake. I stepped back. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things. 18 months into the marriage, my mother died. An aneurysm. Sudden, on a Tuesday morning in September in the middle of a board meeting. She was 59 years old. I was 28. I don't have adequate words for what that kind of grief does to a person, so I won't try to dress it up. It hollowed me out. For months, I couldn't hold a coherent thought for longer than it took to boil water. Grant handled everything. The funeral arrangements, the estate attorney, the endless paperwork that follows a death like a second, quieter death. He would set documents in front of me at the kitchen table and say, "Just sign here. I've already reviewed it." And I did. I signed whatever he put in front of me. I thought it was probate paperwork. It wasn't. There was one moment back then that I didn't understand until much later. About 4 months after the funeral, I overheard Grant on the phone in his study, his voice pitched low, saying the words, "Don't worry, the paperwork's already clean on our end," before he noticed me in the doorway and ended the call abruptly, telling me it was just a routine compliance check for Meridian. I remember thinking at the time that it was strange he'd sounded so relieved to see me standing there rather than annoyed at the interruption, the way he usually was. I didn't ask him anything else. I regret that more than almost anything else in this story, because that sentence, "clean on our end," would come back to me nearly 2 years later, word for word, in a very different context. The months right after my mother's death are still, to this day, the blurriest stretch of my adult life. I remember fragments. I remember Grant handling the funeral home negotiations, choosing a casket while I sat in the car because I couldn't make myself walk through the doors. I remember him fielding calls from Sterling Manor's board, telling them on my behalf that I needed space and that he'd relay any urgent decisions. I remember being grateful for that, genuinely, deeply grateful, the way you're grateful for anyone who steps in and carries weight you can't lift. stopped. It took me years to understand that the weight he was carrying wasn't a burden he was sparing me from. It was leverage he was quietly gathering while I was too broken to notice anyone gathering anything. There was a particular Tuesday, about 6 weeks after the funeral, that I've replayed more times than I can count. I came home from a grief counseling appointment to find my mother's longtime attorney, Corinne Ash, standing in our driveway, her car door still open, visibly upset, mid-argument with Grant on our front lawn. The moment I stepped out of my own car, both of them stopped talking. Corinne looked at me for a long second, like she wanted to say something and then decided against it, got back in her car, and left without coming inside. When I asked Grant what that was about, he sighed, rubbed his eyes, and told me Corinne was having a hard time accepting that the firm's structure was changing under new management, that grief made some people territorial and difficult, and that he hated to see it affect someone who had clearly loved my mother. I remember feeling sorry for Corinne in that moment, actually sorry for her, as if she were the one behaving badly. I didn't call her, not that week, not that year. I let my husband's explanation close a door that I now understand had been the last honest door available to me. For the next 2.5 years, our marriage had a surface calm to it. Grant traveled often for Meridian Freight, sometimes 10 days a month. I threw myself into a slower kind of life, volunteering at the children's hospital where we'd met, staying loosely involved with Sterling Manor through quarterly reports that I now understand were curated for me. 14 months ago, I got pregnant. Grant seemed thrilled. I believed that too. The unraveling started small, the way these things always do. 3 months ago, 5 months pregnant, I tried to update a beneficiary designation on one of my mother's old investment accounts, the one meant to become my daughter's college fund. The firm's client services line told me politely that I wasn't listed as an authorized contact on my own accounts. I asked who was. 2 names came back, Grant Whitmore, and a name I didn't recognize at the time, Brooke Sinclair. I sat in my car in the parking lot of that firm for 40 minutes before I could make myself drive home. That night, looking for anything that might explain the name, I went through a garment bag Grant had left in his home office closet, the one from a business trip to Santa Barbara 2 months earlier. In an inside pocket, I found 2 things: a hotel folio with both his name and a Brooke Sinclair listed as room occupants, and a receipt from a jewelry store I didn't recognize, dated the same week, for an amount that made my stomach drop: $2,200, not a gift I had received. I called the one person I trusted enough to think clearly with, my old college roommate, Priya Shah, who had spent the last several years working as a paralegal for a family law firm in Raleigh. I read her the folio. I read her the receipt. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the words that changed the next 14 months of my life. Document everything. Don't confront him yet. Get a lawyer before you say a single word. I hired Weston Hale the next morning. I learned afterward that Grant's team had already tried to reach out to Weston's firm about a potential conflicts check, an early move to try to lock him out of representing me before I'd even called. We got there first, Weston told me when I mentioned it. You're my client now, and there's nothing he can do about that. That was the beginning of Act 2 of my life, though I didn't have the language for it yet. I just knew that something I had built my entire adult identity around, the idea of my own marriage, was not what I had believed it to be, and I was about to find out exactly how far the lie went. Weston's team spent the first month simply gathering records, quietly, the way you're supposed to before you tip your hand. What they found in that first month was enough to make Weston call me in for what he described, without any drama in his voice, as a conversation I needed to have sitting down. Sterling Manor Group, my grandfather's company, my mother's legacy, had been restructured 11 days after my mother's funeral, not months later, when I might have had the strength to notice. 11 days. The firm had been folded into a newly created holding entity with a name designed to sound bureaucratic and forgettable, Ashcombe Holdings LLC, and the sole managing member listed on the filing was Grant Whitmore. I stared at the document Weston slid across his desk. That's not possible, I told him. I never signed anything transferring the company. My mother's will named me as successor. He turned the page. There at the bottom was a signature that looked almost exactly like mine. Almost. That's not my signature, I said. Weston nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer and had already prepared for it. His forensic document analyst had flagged the same page independently before I ever saw it. The pen pressure was inconsistent with my known signatures. The letter formation in my middle initial didn't match 11 other verified samples, pulled from tax returns, hospital forms, and my mother's own estate documents, all of which I had genuinely signed. His analyst's report gave it a 96% probability of forgery. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because I think it matters to anyone listening who has been in a version of this fog. I had signed dozens of documents in the months after my mother died. I couldn't tell you under oath exactly which ones I remembered signing and which ones I didn't. That uncertainty is exactly what predators like Grant count on. They don't need you to be unconscious. They just need you to be too exhausted to read carefully, and too trusting to imagine that the person holding your hand through your grief is the same person picking your pocket while he does it. Over the following weeks, the picture kept expanding. Walter Greer, the financial manager Grant had introduced me to in our first year of marriage, had been paid a monthly retainer from a Meridian Freight subsidiary account since 8 months before our wedding. Every recommendation he'd ever made to me, every account he'd consolidated, every investment he'd steered me toward, had been made by a man whose actual client the whole time was my husband. There was an earlier incident I hadn't thought much about until Weston asked me directly whether anything had ever felt off before my mother died, and there was something. About 4 months into our marriage, I'd come home early from a hospital volunteer shift and found Grant in his home office with Walter Greer and a man I didn't recognize. Papers spread across the desk, all three of them going quiet the moment I walked in. Grant told me it was just insurance paperwork, boring stuff, nothing I needed to worry my head about. I remember he used that exact phrase, worry my head about. At the time, I found it a little condescending and let it go. In hindsight, that was the earliest planning session I know of for what would eventually become Ashcombe Holdings, and I had walked directly into it and walked back out again without understanding what I was looking at. The dynamic between Grant and me, before all of this, had been one of quiet deference dressed up as partnership. He made the big decisions and framed them as things we'd decided together. He handled the money and called it protecting me. He discouraged my involvement at Sterling Manor and called it prioritizing our marriage. I want to be fair to my past self here. I wasn't a fool. I was a grieving 28-year-old woman who trusted her husband more than she trusted her own gut. And there is a version of almost anyone who could end up exactly where I ended up if the right person decided to spend years building the trap slowly enough that it never once felt like a trap closing. Grant noticed something had shifted in me long before I ever confronted him directly, and the 5 weeks between my discovery and the filing became their own kind of war, fought entirely in a register just below the surface of normal conversation. The first move came about 10 days after I found the hotel folio. I'd started asking small, careful questions, nothing that would tip my hand, just testing the shape of things. "Are you traveling to Santa Barbara again this quarter?" I asked one evening, over a dinner I barely touched. Grant looked up from his plate and said, with total unhurried calm, that he'd actually been meaning to talk to me about how withdrawn I'd seemed lately. "Ever since the accounts thing," he said, gesturing vaguely, like my discovery of my own exclusion from my own money was a minor personality quirk of mine rather than a fact he'd engineered. "You've been different," he said, distant. "Is this the pregnancy, or is something else going on with you?" I remember sitting there, stunned by the sheer architecture of it, how effortlessly he'd converted my suspicion into a symptom he could diagnose. That was the first ceiling. I told myself it couldn't get more disorienting than being gaslit in my own kitchen. I was wrong. The second move came 2 weeks later, after Priya had helped me quietly print copies of the account correspondence, and I'd made the mistake of leaving my laptop open on the kitchen counter for 11 minutes while I answered the door for a delivery. Grant never confronted me about what he saw. Instead, 3 days later, he brought home flowers, made my favorite dinner, and told me gently that his mother had called, worried about how isolated I'd become since my mother's death, and that maybe it would help if I spent less time on my phone and more time letting the people who loved me take care of me. He was weaponizing the one relationship I still trusted completely, using his mother's genuine concern as a leash. I called Patricia the next day, casually, and she had no memory of the conversation Grant described. That was the second ceiling breaking. The third move was the most dangerous, because it came wrapped in something that looked for a moment like vulnerability. 6 weeks before the hearing, at nearly 7 months pregnant, I told Grant I wanted to see a different financial advisor, someone outside Walter Greer's firm, just to get a second opinion on our retirement accounts. Grant's face did something I'd never seen it do before. He looked briefly like he might cry. He told me that if I brought in outside people, if I started treating our marriage like a business audit, he didn't know how he'd survive it, that he'd been under enormous stress at Meridian, that his cardiologist had flagged some numbers at his last checkup, and that the added conflict might be more than his heart could take right now. I sat with him that night while he described chest tightness he claimed to have felt that afternoon, torn between concern and a small, cold voice in the back of my mind that had started, for the first time in 6 years, to keep score. I later learned, through Weston's investigator, that Grant's last cardiology appointment on record was 14 months earlier and showed no abnormal findings of any kind. He had used his own health as leverage against my instincts, and it had very nearly worked. The fourth move came directly, and it was the one that made Priya insist I stop responding to him entirely, except through Weston's office. 4 weeks before the hearing, Grant sat me down and told me, in the calm, reasonable voice he used for board presentations, that if I pursued any legal action regarding Sterling Manor, he would have no choice but to reconsider how much financial support he could offer once the baby arrived, given how expensive contested litigation tended to get. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it as a simple, unfortunate consequence of my own choices, the same way he'd always framed every consequence of his own decisions as something I had somehow brought upon myself. "Think about what's actually best for her," he said, resting a hand briefly on my stomach in a gesture that used to comfort me and now made my skin crawl. I moved his hand and told him I was thinking about exactly that. The fifth and final ceiling came 3 weeks before the hearing, when Grant, apparently sensing that persuasion wasn't working, shifted tactics entirely and began playing the victim in front of anyone who would listen. He told colleagues at Meridian that I was struggling with prenatal anxiety and had become erratic. He told his mother I'd accused him, unfairly, of infidelity, framing Brooke as nothing more than a junior colleague he occasionally traveled with for work. He even, I learned later from Weston's investigator, reached out to my own Aunt Diane, the one relative I still spoke to regularly, suggesting gently that perhaps the family should could keep an eye on me, that grief and pregnancy hormones could do strange things to a person's judgment. It was Aunt Diane's confused, half-alarmed voicemail to me, asking if I was doing okay, that finally showed me the full shape of what Grant was building in the world outside our marriage, while I'd been quietly building my case inside it. It was during this same stretch, buried in a folder Weston's paralegal had assembled almost as an afterthought, that I noticed something I'd later understand was the single most important detail in the entire case. A wire transfer confirmation, dated 11 months earlier, referencing an internal memo line that read, simply, same template as before. At the time, it meant nothing to me. I filed it away in my memory the way you file away a stray word in a language you don't yet speak, without knowing that Weston's team would eventually trace that exact phrase back to the email between Grant and Walter Greer that would break the entire case open in front of Judge Halloran. By the time I was 7 months pregnant, Weston's team had assembled enough to file. The hearing was set for a Thursday. I remember thinking, with something close to gallows humor, that I would be exactly as pregnant as a person could reasonably be and still make it up a courthouse staircase. The night before the hearing, Weston called me at 9:47 p.m. Grant's legal team had filed an emergency motion just before midnight the previous evening, a scramble designed to reshuffle the docket and buy time, the kind of last-minute maneuver Weston said was meant to rattle me into requesting a postponement. If you ask for more time, he told me, Grant's team gets to control the story in the meantime. They'll spend that time building a narrative about your instability. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and my hand on my stomach, and I told him I wasn't postponing anything. I didn't sleep much that night. I laid out my navy dress, the only maternity formal wear I owned that didn't feel like a costume, and I took my grandmother's pearl earrings out of the box where they'd sat since my wedding day. I remember thinking that if I was going to walk into that courtroom and lose everything, I wanted to at least be wearing something that belonged to a woman who had never once let anyone push her around. I drove myself to the courthouse the next morning. I sat alone at the defense table at 8:45 a.m., 17 minutes early, my hands folded over the bump that had by then become the entire center of gravity of my life. Weston's chair stayed empty. He'd texted that a scheduling conflict on another case had run long and he'd be a few minutes behind. I told myself a few minutes wasn't a crisis. I was wrong about that too, though not in the way I expected. Grant arrived at 9:02, flanked by his 3 attorneys, moving through the gallery with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been made to wait for anything. Brooke Sinclair walked in on his arm. I hadn't seen her in person before that morning, only in the grainy hotel folio photo Weston's team had pulled. In person, she was younger than me by what I guessed was 6 or 7 years, dressed sharply, already smiling at something Grant murmured to her before he even reached the table. She looked, I remember thinking, like a woman who believed she had already won. Grant crossed the aisle and crouched beside my chair before the bailiff hauled the room to order. Sign the settlement, he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. Walk away with whatever dignity you have left. I looked at him and I told him exactly what I wanted. Basic child support, my share of the marital assets, medical coverage through delivery, nothing more than what was fair. Brooke, standing just behind him, let out a short, sharp laugh. You trapped a successful man with a pregnancy, she said, loud enough that 2 people in the gallery turned around. And now you want fairness? I looked her directly in the eye. Don't speak about my child. That was when her smile disappeared, when her shoulder rotated back half a second before her palm came across my face. The bailiff was already moving, one hand up, telling everyone to stay where they were. My lips split against my teeth. I tasted copper before I registered the sting. My hand went to my stomach first, checking, always checking, before it even went to my face. Somewhere behind me, a woman in the gallery gasped. Grant looked at Brooke's hand, still raised, and he laughed. Quiet, private. This is exactly the instability I warned everyone about, he said. Not to me, not to the room, but to the air, like a man narrating a documentary about his own innocence while standing over the wreckage of his own lie. I looked up. Judge Halloran was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on a judge's face before. Something old and dangerous, like a man who had just watched a piece of furniture reveal a trapdoor he'd walked past 1,000 times without knowing it was there. Bailiff, he said, and his voice was flat as a sealed vault. Seal the courtroom. The doors swung shut with a sound that seemed to change the air pressure in the room. No one moved. Grant's smirk flickered, just barely. The first crack I'd seen in 6 years. Judge Halloran spoke my name then, my full name, Eleanor Margaret Hastings. Not Whitmore, not the shortened version Grant had used for 6 years to slowly sand my mother's family off the edges of who I was. Grant went very still. Mr. Whitmore, the judge said, are you familiar with the emergency filing submitted to this court at 7:15 this morning? Grant's lead attorney rose halfway out of his chair. Your Honor, my client's wife has a documented pattern of instab. I did not ask for your opinion, the judge said, without raising his voice at all, which somehow made it worse. Sit down. The attorney sat down. The judge lifted a folder from beneath his bench, one that had not been there when we'd walked in. A folder I would later learn Weston had personally filed with the clerk's office at dawn, after an all-night session cross-referencing 3 separate Discovery productions with a whistleblower email that had landed in his inbox at 4:12 that morning from an address he didn't recognize. He read for 11 straight minutes. No one in that courtroom breathed the way people normally breathe. I watched his eyes move down page after page. Prenatal records with a doctor's handwritten notation about bruising I had explained away as a fall on on wet tile, bank statements showing withdrawals from the account that had once held my mother's life insurance payout, timed to the same week we buried her, a forensic signature analysis with a red stamp reading 96% probability of forgery, and then, near the bottom of the stack, a set of text messages between Grant and Brooke. Timestamps lined up almost exactly with my prenatal appointments, discussing arrangements I still could not fully make myself absorb while sitting 8 months pregnant in a courtroom. Then the judge closed the folder. He took off his glasses, slow, deliberate, the way a man does when he wants everyone in the room to understand that what comes next is not procedure. It's a verdict on a person's character. 2 words, he said, looking directly at Grant. Both accounts. Grant's face went the color of the folder. Brooke's eyes cut sideways toward the sealed doors, like she was measuring the distance, calculating whether there was still a version of this morning where she could leave before anyone said her name out loud again. Grant's attorney grabbed his sleeve, a half-second too late to matter. The judge was already looking straight at Grant, asking him, on the record, whether he understood what those 2 words meant, or whether he needed the court to spell it out for him in front of his own mistress. Grant didn't answer. He just stared at that folder like it might start crawling toward him across the table. Watching his hands shake for the first time in 6 years of marriage, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand until that exact second. I still didn't know everything Weston had found, and judging by the color draining out of Brooke Sinclair's face, neither did she. Weston arrived 4 minutes later, out of breath, apologizing to the bench, and the judge simply said, "Counsel, you're going to want to sit down and read this before you say anything else on the record." What Weston laid out over the next half hour, once the judge allowed him to address the court, was the piece I had been missing since the moment I first found that hotel folio in a garment bag. Grant hadn't simply been unfaithful. He hadn't simply forged my signature to fold Sterling Manor into a shell company 11 days after my mother's funeral. He had used the exact same mechanism, the same forged signature template, the same shell entity structure through Walter Greer to move money out of a family trust belonging to Brooke Sinclair. Her late father's trust, a modest but meaningful account meant to fund the interior design business she'd been trying to launch for 2 years. Grant had told her, apparently, that he was helping her access the funds faster by consolidating them under Ashcombe Holdings for tax efficiency. In reality, $140,000 of Brooke's inheritance had been quietly rerouted into the same corporate structure holding what remained of my mother's company, all of it sitting under Grant's sole managing authority, none of it accessible to either of the 2 women who were legally entitled to it. The detail that broke the case open, the one Weston's team had found buried in a subpoenaed email server 2 nights before the hearing, was a message Grant had sent to Walter Greer 11 months earlier. Use the same template as before, it read. Same firm, this makes it invisible. Worked once, it'll work twice. He had not even bothered to change his own words. The forgery that stole my mother's company and the forgery that stole Brooke's inheritance were, in his own writing, the same crime committed twice against 2 different women who both believed, until that morning, that he loved them. I felt the floor tilt a little, understanding that all at once. Every kindness I had assigned to him over 6 years, every excuse I had built on his behalf, collapsed under the weight of a man who apparently viewed both of us as interchangeable line items in the same scheme. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I looked over at Brooke. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at Grant, and something in her face had shifted entirely. The performance gone, replaced by something rawer and more frightened than anything she'd shown me all morning. "You told me it was for the business," she said, quiet at first, then louder. "You told me it would be in my account by spring." Grant didn't turn to face her. He kept his eyes fixed on the folder, on the judge, on anywhere that wasn't her. "Brooke," he said, low, careful. "We'll talk about this later." "There is no later," she said, and for the first time since I'd met her 40 minutes earlier, I believed every word she said. Judge Halloran let the silence sit for a long moment before he spoke again. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "this court is going to refer the forgery findings, both instances, to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. In the meantime, I am granting an emergency asset freeze on all accounts under Ashcombe Holdings LLC, effective immediately, pending a full forensic accounting. I am also entering a temporary order, restoring Mrs. Whitmore's authorized access to Sterling Manor Group and all associated accounts, and I am referring the matter of Ms. Sinclair's trust to a separate civil action, should she choose to pursue one." Grant's attorney tried once more. "Your Honor, if I could just have a moment to confer with my client." "You'll have all the moments you need," the judge said, "once this courtroom reopens. Right now, I want to hear from Mrs. Whitmore." I hadn't expected to be asked to speak. I stood slowly, one hand braced on the table, the other still resting on my stomach where my daughter had gone still, the way she always did when my heart rate spiked. I looked at Grant, really looked at him, for what I understood in that moment was one of the last times I would ever have to. "You didn't just lie to me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You stood in this room and let a woman hit a pregnant woman in the face, and you laughed. You have spent 6 years telling me you were protecting me from stress, from complexity, from having to worry my head about things. You used that exact phrase on me once, in your office, with the door closed, and I let it go because I trusted you more than I trusted myself. I don't anymore." I looked over at Brooke, whose eyes were wet now. Whatever remained of her composure gone. "And you," I said to her, not unkindly, because I recognized something in her face I understood too well. "He did the same thing to you. Ask yourself how many other women he's told that to." Brooke didn't answer. She sat down heavily in the row behind Grant's table, putting distance between herself and the man she'd walked in on the arm of 45 minutes earlier. Grant finally looked at me. For a moment, just a flicker, I saw something that might have been close to real feeling, before it hardened back into the practiced calm he'd worn for 6 years like a second skin. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly, making a spectacle, dragging the company through a criminal referral. "Think about what this does to the baby, growing up with all this noise around her name." I felt something settle in me then, cold and clear, the last piece of fear I'd been carrying finally leaving my body. "Don't," I said. "Don't you dare put her in your mouth. Everything noisy about this story is because of what you did, not what I'm doing about it. My daughter is going to grow up knowing her mother stood up in a courtroom instead of signing whatever you put in front of her. That's the only part of this she needs to know." The judge banged the gavel once, more of a formality than a demand for order, since the room had gone still on its own. "This hearing is adjourned pending criminal referral and the emergency asset freeze I've just ordered," he said. "Bailiff, unseal the doors." The next 6 weeks moved faster than I could fully track, even living through every hour of them. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation the following Monday. 2 forensic accountants Weston brought in traced Ashcombe Holdings back through 4 layers of shell structuring, uncovering not just the forged transfer of Sterling Manor and the drained trust belonging to Brooke, but a third account, smaller, almost overlooked. An old custodial account my mother had opened in my name when I was 9 years old, meant for a house down payment someday, that Grant had also folded into Ashcombe 18 months into our marriage. $14,000, barely a rounding error compared to the rest, but somehow that smaller number was the one that made me cry the hardest. Sitting in Weston's office with the printout in my hands, it felt less like corporate greed and more like theft from a child who no longer existed, the girl I used to be before I ever met Grant Whitmore. Word moved through Wilmington the way it always does in a city small enough that everyone's business intersects somewhere. Meridian Freight's board placed Grant on administrative leave within 4 days of the hearing, citing the criminal referral and a swiftly convened internal review that turned up 2 more instances of Walter Greer's fingerprints on transactions the board had assumed were routine. Walter was indicted 11 weeks later on charges of conspiracy to commit forgery and breach of fiduciary duty. He took a plea deal that required his testimony against Grant in exchange for a reduced sentence. And in his deposition, he described, in flat, procedural language, exactly how the Ashcombe scheme had been built, brick by brick, starting 4 months into my marriage, in that home office I had walked into once without understanding what I was looking at. Brooke reached out to me 8 days after the hearing. I almost didn't answer the call. When I did, she was crying before she finished saying my name. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for the courtroom," she said. "I don't expect that. I just needed you to know I didn't know about your accounts, about your mother's company, any of it. I thought I was the only one." I sat with that for a long moment before I answered her. "I believe you," I said, and I meant it, though belief and forgiveness turned out to be 2 very different rooms, and I wasn't ready to walk into the second one yet. She ended up filing her own civil suit against Grant 3 weeks later, represented, at Weston's recommendation, by a colleague of his who specialized in fiduciary fraud. We were never friends after that, but we were, unexpectedly, allies in the same fight, sitting 2 rows apart at 3 separate hearings over the following year, nodding at each other in a way that wasn't warmth exactly, but wasn't nothing either. Not everyone in my life responded the way I expected. My mother's sister, my Aunt Diane, who I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years after a disagreement about the estate that I now understood, with fresh eyes, had probably been engineered by Grant to isolate me from her, called the week after the hearing and cried on the phone for 10 straight minutes before she could get a full sentence out. "I tried to warn you at the funeral," she said. "You told me I was grieving badly and taking it out on Grant. I didn't correct her. She wasn't wrong." Corinne Ash, my mother's old attorney, the one I'd watched leave our driveway in tears 3 years earlier without ever calling her back, agreed to consult with Weston's team once the criminal referral became public, and it was her original, unaltered version of the Sterling Manor succession documents, the ones she'd drafted with my mother 8 months before she died, that ultimately became the cleanest piece of evidence proving what the real plan had always been before Grant rewrote it. The board at Meridian Freight, once the criminal referral became public record, moved with the kind of speed that only ever seems to exist when a company's reputation is on the line, rather than when a person's life is. 2 former Meridian employees, both of whom had worked directly under Grant, reached out to Weston's office independently within the same week, describing a pattern of pressuring subordinates to backdate expense reports and route certain vendor payments through accounts that never quite matched the invoices attached to them. Neither of those threads turned into criminal charges, since neither employee was willing to testify formally, but Weston used both statements to support the civil claims, painting a picture of a man whose relationship to the truth had never been limited to his marriage. I found a strange, cold comfort in that. It meant I hadn't simply failed to notice the one lie that mattered. I had been living, unknowingly, inside a pattern that predated me entirely. Word of the hearing eventually reached beyond Wilmington's business circles, thanks to a local news reporter who'd been sitting in the gallery that morning covering an unrelated case case and stayed once the doors were sealed. The story ran 2 days later, stripped of names where the court allowed, but detailed enough that people who knew us filled in the blanks within hours. I braced myself for the worst kind of attention, the sort that turns a person's private unraveling into public entertainment, and some of that did happen. Strangers online speculating about details they knew nothing about. But what surprised me more was the volume of quiet, private messages I received from women I barely knew. Former classmates, neighbors, a woman from my prenatal yoga class I'd exchanged maybe 10 sentences with, each describing some smaller, less prosecutable version of the same dynamic in their own lives. I didn't respond to most of them at the time. I didn't have the capacity, but I kept every message, and I've gone back and read them since, on the harder nights, as a reminder that whatever isolation Grant had spent years building around me, it had never actually been as complete as he wanted me to believe. Grant's mother, a woman named Patricia, who had always been kind to me in a distant, formal way, sent a card 2 months into the proceedings. I don't know what to say to you, it read, except that I raised him better than this, and I am so sorry that clearly wasn't enough. I kept that card. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because it was the only piece of communication from anyone in Grant's family that didn't try to minimize, explain away, or negotiate down what had happened. Grant made 2 more desperate moves before the criminal case fully swallowed his attention. The first was a motion filed by his 4th attorney in 5 months, arguing that the emergency asset freeze on Ashcombe Holdings was unconstitutional overreach, a motion the judge denied in less than a page of written opinion that used the word frivolous twice. The second was quieter and uglier, an attempt, 3 weeks before my due date, to have a mutual friend reach out to me suggesting that if I softened my position in the civil proceedings, he'd consider not contesting full custody arrangements once the baby was born. I didn't respond to the friend. I forwarded the message directly to Weston, who forwarded it directly to the DA's office as evidence of an attempted improper influence on a witness in an active criminal matter. Grant's bail conditions were modified within the week to include no contact, direct or indirect, with me or my legal counsel. There was a night, about a month after the hearing, when none of the anger or momentum of the case was enough to keep me from simply grieving. I sat alone in the nursery I'd painted a soft, pale yellow the previous fall, back when I still believed I was preparing this room for a family that existed the way I thought it did, and I let myself cry for the marriage I had actually wanted, not the one I'd been given. I mourned the version of Grant I met at that hospital gala, the one who remembered small details and made me feel chosen. I understood sitting there that grieving him wasn't a betrayal of my own strength, it was just honest. Something real had been offered to me once, or at least something that felt real, and it had never actually existed, and both of those facts could be true and painful at the same time. The legal proceedings dragged on with the particular grinding slowness of anything involving forensic accounting and criminal referral. The forensic team's final report ran to 211 pages and traced roughly $2.1 million across the combined schemes touching Sterling Manor, my custodial account, and Brooks Trust. Grant eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial, pleading guilty to 2 counts of forgery and 1 count of embezzlement, receiving a sentence of 6 years, with the possibility of parole after 3, alongside a restitution order covering the full amount plus interest. Sterling Manor Group's board, with Corinne Ash's help, restructured under my direct control within 4 months, restoring the governance framework my mother had built and that Grant had spent 3 years quietly dismantling. My daughter Josephine was born 5 weeks after the hearing, on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks earlier than her due date, as if she had absorbed some of the urgency of the year she'd spent listening to all of it from the inside. I was in a delivery room with Priya on one side of the bed and Aunt Diane on the other, 2 women who had shown up for me in ways I hadn't fully let myself need before that year. Grant was not there. He'd been formally served with the modified no-contact order 9 days earlier. I remember thinking, in the strange, floating exhaustion right after they placed her on my chest, that this was the first entirely uncomplicated joy I'd felt in over a year, and that she deserved to be the reason for that, not a footnote in someone else's unraveling. The logistics of untangling a life from a man like Grant took far longer than the criminal case itself. There were joint accounts to close, each one requiring its own set of affidavits. There was the house, which Weston advised me to sell rather than fight to keep, since half its equity was still tied up in litigation over how much of the down payment had originated from money later traced to Ashcombe Holdings. I moved into a smaller place near the hospital where I still volunteered, a 2-bedroom with a porch that caught the morning light, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that smaller suited me better than the house I'd shared with Grant ever had. There was a tax complication too, an entire spring spent working with an accountant to properly characterize the restitution payments as they slowly began arriving, quarterly, court-ordered, a fraction of what had been taken but real money nonetheless, landing in accounts that were, for the first time in 6 years, entirely and verifiably mine. Walter Greer's testimony, once it was fully entered into the record, filled in the last gaps I'd been carrying around as unanswered questions. He confirmed that Corinne Ash's driveway confrontation, the one I'd never followed up on, had happened because she'd noticed an irregularity in the succession paperwork within weeks of my mother's death and had tried twice to reach me directly before Grant intercepted both calls and told her, falsely, that I'd asked her to stop contacting the family during my grieving period. period. Hearing that, months later, in a deposition transcript Weston forwarded to me, was its own small, quiet grief. Corinne had tried. I had simply never been given the chance to hear her. I want to be honest about the parts of this that don't resolve neatly, because I think stories like this one too often skip past that for the sake of a clean ending. Josephine will grow up eventually and ask about her father, and I don't yet know exactly what I'll say, only that I've promised myself it will be true, and it will be age-appropriate, and it will never once ask her to carry my anger for me. Brooke and I still exchange a message every few months, mostly logistical, sometimes almost warm, two women who share nothing in common except having trusted the same man and having eventually told the truth about it in the same room. Grant writes to me sometimes from Craven Correctional, letters I have Weston's office screen before I ever see them, and most of them I don't answer, though twice. When Josephine was very small, I sent back a single photograph with no note attached, because even now, I can't quite make myself believe that a child should be punished for the sins of the man who fathered her, whatever else that man turned out to be. The custody arrangement, once it was finally settled, ended up simpler than I expected, mostly because Grant's plea agreement and subsequent incarceration removed most of the contested questions that would otherwise have dragged through family court for another year. The judge overseeing that separate proceeding, a woman named Judge Renata Okafor, granted me sole legal and physical custody, with a provision allowing supervised visitation once Grant's sentence concluded, contingent on a court-ordered psychological evaluation and a demonstrated period of stability. I don't know, honestly, what I'll do when that provision becomes relevant in real time, rather than as a line on a piece of paper. I try not to solve problems 3 years before they arrive. I've had enough practice this past year, learning to live one honest day at a time instead of pre-grieving every version of the future that might come. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Ann Merchant, about 2 months after the hearing, initially just to manage the acute stress of the ongoing litigation, and stayed in that chair far longer than I expected to, because it turned out there was a great deal more underneath the immediate crisis that deserved attention. We spent a lot of sessions on a question I hadn't let myself ask directly until she asked it for me. Not why did Grant do this, which had an answer I already understood, entitlement dressed up as competence, resentment of my mother's success, a taste for control that needed increasingly larger rooms to move around in. But why had I made myself so available to it? That question took longer to sit with. The honest answer, the one I arrived at slowly over the better part of a year, was that I had spent my entire life being the daughter of a formidable woman, and some quiet, unexamined part of me had married a man who let me be smaller, because smaller felt, for a while, like rest. I don't say that to excuse what Grant did. Nothing excuses it. But understanding my own part in building the conditions that let it happen has mattered to my recovery every bit as much as the criminal case did. Josephine is 2 now. She has my mother's stubborn chin and, infuriatingly, Grant's easy laugh, and I've stopped flinching every time I catch that resemblance, because she is entirely her own person, and it isn't fair to her to keep score of which parts of her face belong to which of the people who made her. Sterling Manor Group finished its second full fiscal year under my leadership this spring, back to the kind of quiet, steady profitability my grandfather built it on, and I sit in my mother's old office now, at her old desk, which I had refinished rather than replaced, because some things deserve to be restored instead of thrown out. I still volunteer at the Children's Hospital on Thursday afternoons, the same wing where Grant once asked me about a seating chart before he asked me my name, and I've made a kind of peace with the fact that the place where my old life began is also the place where I choose, every week, to build the new one. I think about that courtroom often, more than I expected to, given how badly I wanted to leave it behind. I think about the sound of Brooke's hand against my face, and how strange it is that the worst moment of that entire ordeal turned out to be the one that finally cracked it open. I think about Grant's laugh, quiet and private, and how I used to hear affection in sounds like that, back when I didn't yet know what it actually meant when a man laughs at your pain instead of flinching from it. And I think, most of all, about Judge Halloran's 2 words, both accounts, and how strange it is that the phrase which ended my marriage was also the phrase that told me, for certain, that I had never been the only one he was capable of doing this to, and that some part of surviving him meant learning to feel something closer to grief than triumph when I thought about that. Because that's the part nobody tells you about stories like mine. You don't walk out of a courtroom like that feeling like you won. You walk out feeling like you survived something that should never have been built in the first place, carrying a version of grief or a marriage that was never real alongside something that felt, unmistakably, like relief. Both of those things live in me now, most days, at the same time. I lost 6 years I can't get back, a version of trust I don't know if I'll ever fully rebuild with anyone else, and a story about my own life that I had believed, right up until the moment a folder hit a judge's desk, was simply true. What I gained was smaller and stranger and most days enough, a daughter who will never once have to wonder whether her mother knew how to stand up for her, a company restored to the values it was actually built on, and the particular, hard-won piece of a woman who was slapped in open court, 8 months pregnant, and didn't fold. There's a version of this story, the version I sometimes imagine other people telling at dinner parties, where the ending is louder than the one I actually have, where Grant gets exactly what he deserves and I feel something clean and triumphant watching it happen, where Brooke stays a villain instead of becoming, in her own complicated way, someone I understand, where the money comes back whole and untouched and the years come back with with it. That isn't the ending I got, and I've made my peace with that, mostly, on the days when peace is available to me. Some days it isn't. Some days I still find myself standing in the kitchen with my hand on the counter, remembering the exact sound of that slap, and I have to sit down until it passes. What I've learned, if there's a single thread running underneath all of it, is that the people who hurt us most rarely look like villains while they're doing it. Grant never once in 6 years raised his voice at me. He never broke a single dish or slammed a single door. He simply narrated my own life back to me, slightly altered, one calm sentence at a time, until I couldn't tell the difference between his version of events and my own instincts anymore. That's a harder thing to explain to people than a bruise. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't fit neatly into a single dramatic scene, except, I suppose, for the one where a stranger's hand finally did what 6 years of quiet manipulation couldn't, which was leave a mark visible enough that everyone in the room, myself included, finally had to look directly at what was happening. Weston closed our file, formally, 13 months after the hearing, once the last piece of restitution had cleared, and Sterling Manor's restructuring was finalized with the state. He told me, at our last meeting, that in 22 years of practicing family law, he'd handled maybe 4 cases with a paper trail as clean as the one his team had built against Grant, and that most people never get anything close to that kind of vindication, not because their stories are less true, but because the evidence simply isn't there to prove what they already know in their bones. I've thought about that a lot since. How much of what happened to me was justice, and how much of it was luck? A garment bag left unzipped, a whistleblower email that happened to land at 4:12 in the morning, a judge willing to read 11 straight minutes of documents in dead silence instead of rushing the docket. I try to hold both of those truths at once. I fought for this outcome with everything I had. I also got luckier than most women in my position ever do, and I don't think it does anyone any favors to pretend otherwise. I named my daughter Josephine after my mother's middle name, not her first, because I wanted her to carry a piece of that woman forward without carrying the full weight of expectation that comes with a first name. She is loud and funny, and entirely unbothered by things that would have paralyzed me at her age, and I like to think some of that comes from having a mother who, whatever else was happening around her, never once let a courtroom, a slap, or a man's carefully constructed calm talk her out of what she knew to be true. I still have my grandmother's pearl earrings. I wore them again last month to Sterling Manor's spring shareholder dinner, and caught my reflection in the ballroom window before I walked in, and thought, not for the first time, that some inheritances can be stolen and rebuilt, and some can never be taken from you at all, no matter how long someone spends trying. The slap left no permanent mark on my face. What it left instead was the last piece of proof I needed that the man I'd built a life around had never once, in 6 years, actually seen me as a person capable of leaving. He was wrong about that. I think, in the end, that miscalculation is the only part of this whole story he never managed to explain his way out of. Sometimes, driving Josephine home from the hospital on Thursday afternoons, I pass the courthouse without meaning to. The route just happens to run past it, and I slow down without deciding to. The way you slow down near any place that once held the worst hour of your life. I don't feel dread anymore when I see it. Mostly, I feel something closer to respect for the version of myself who walked up those steps alone at 8:45 in the morning, 17 minutes early, 8 months pregnant, wearing her grandmother's earrings, with no idea that within the hour a stranger's hand would do what 6 years of careful, quiet manipulation never quite managed, which was make the truth impossible for anyone in that room to look away from. I wasn't lucky enough to avoid what happened to me, but I was lucky enough in the end to be believed, and I've stopped taking that for granted, even on the days when everything else about this story still aches.